Second interview with Alexander Laurent. Interviewed and filmed by the YouTubers Eurasia Couple, from 10th to 12th of August 2018. Parts 1 and 2 of the second interview premiered on December the 27th, 2019 on the BitChute channels Alexi Laurent and Iranian Human, Parts 3 and 4 on March the 12th and 13th, 2020. On the latter days, Eurasia Couple also published the complete second interview on their eponymous YouTube channel. Please note, the following interview was conducted with a whistleblower who must remain unrecognized. His activities and work are within completely inaccessible areas, completely unknown to secret services and the highest elite groups. This interview is the first of a total of 3 interviews, each consisting of 4 individual sections/videos. The series reveals that humanity is still deeply and firmly asleep. That under the conditions on Earth there was no awakening of mankind, but that the awakened people themselves, with all the supposedly liberating approaches from alternative enlightenment, New Age, promises of salvation, belief in good aliens, esotericism and religious longings for salvation, are on their way into the New World Order. Only this generates the New World Order. Everything, including mythological and mysterious phenomena or wishful thinking about a better world, the Golden Age, is part of a staging of a complexly coordinated network of disinformation, psychological guidance and control mechanisms, which for humanity is to end in a religious and esoteric spiritual liberation performance. Out of it the New World Order is born. The actual goal, however, the long-term goal, so to speak, will lead to a biological digitalization of humanity in the centuries to come, in order to be able to integrate our species into a dominantly acting intergalactic federation. In these interviews, no separate answers are presented, for example with regard to so-called mysteries, secret world leaders, religions or the numerous profane control systems, but rather the comprehensible, coherent overall picture is conveyed between all these seemingly different thematic complexes. In order to understand these contents and connections and to be able to get an unmistakable overview, it is recommended to follow the correct order of the interviews, with all their parts. A condition of the whistleblower to the film crew recording the interviews was that we too remain unrecognized. Therefore, all interviews were mostly created without the visual integration of the interviewer in the videos, in order to avoid the possibility of a clear identification of all persons involved in these interviews. Due to dialectical peculiarities, the voices of the interlocutors were recorded again and distorted. Emotions and vocal accentuation were taken over and imitated true to the original. All statements of the interlocutors were optimized in their sentence structure, without additions, changes or omissions. To protect his identity, the whistleblower wore a spacesuit with helmet. Areas have been pasted over the helmet which make the brand name of the helmet unrecognizable. A foil was attached in front of the visor to prevent reflections of the coulis. First and second interviews were conducted in July/August 2018, each consisting of 4 parts, which will be published one after the other. The third 4-part interview will be conducted in summer 2019 and published by June 2020. If the third interview is not published, our work was actively hindered or prevented. This interview was held in German and translated into English using an automatic translation program. Therefore, it may happen that some sentences contain grammatical errors, some sentence structure is incorrect, commas are set incorrectly and some expressions are inaccurate. The transcription of the interview was made without any slip of the tongue and without long pauses. Emotional reactions were mostly not transcribed. All statements were optimized in their sentence structure, without additions, changes or omissions. Please distribute these interviews widely, to friends, acquaintances, work colleagues, people from the social media, everywhere in the English-speaking world. The wide distribution of the information in these interviews will be of great importance for the coming period into which humanity is now entering. Thank you very much. Hello dear viewers and welcome to the second interview with Mr. Alexander Laurent. Mr. Laurent, thank you very much for coming to us for a second time and for answering a few more questions and taking us deeper into the rabbit hole. In return, I would like to briefly summarize what you have to say about yourself. More than 6 years ago you published your novel The Apocalypse of God, a revelation under your author pseudonym Alexander Laurent, and then sent your novel unasked and anonymously to 214 people. To people who belong, as you say, to a special area of life and work, as well as to public figures who, then as now, design and produce broadcasting formats in the alternative media. In the time after your book was sent out, the prophecies of the future you had kept hidden and encoded in the novel were gradually fulfilled, in the form of historical and news events which the unsolicited recipients of the novel were to recognize. In order to be able to recognize and verify this, you wrote a blog that shows all readers of the novel these predictions, thereby simultaneously documenting the novel's authenticity, origin and destination. Because in our last interview you emphasized that your novel is about manipulation by dark entities, a literary work produced by extraterrestrial and demonic entities, including an AI, which you called Yahweh, who will want to bring humanity into a certain direction of development. Among other things, these entities tried to do so with this literary work. On the other hand, today we are also influenced by other entities, people, as you say, a future humanity that intervenes without being noticed by the dark entities that are watching us. Influences and changes from these people of the future have been incorporated into the novel, which have been integrated into the novel piggyback, so to speak, via the dark entities, thus creating a second reading of your novel. For the viewer, this novel can be downloaded for free. Just click on the links below this video and read the accompanying blog. Well, this short introduction without details and more detailed explanations may sound a bit strange to many people who have not seen the first interview, and it seems to be complicated material. Therefore, we would like to advise all viewers who, despite the introduction to this interview, are still interested in this topic, to watch our first interview first, so that they can follow the content of this second interview later on.
Correct. Thank you very much for the introduction and the continuation of the previous interview. Hello dear viewers. Thank you very much for tuning in for the second interview. I wish you a fearless listening and further on a good conversation, as far as this does not sound impious in view of some gruesome but nevertheless necessary topics to be addressed. In the previous interview I described the deeper reasons and causes for our situation on Earth. Therefore, I do not want to go into all the complex structures and causes that are hidden behind the visible events on Earth, but I want to follow up on the previous interview by going into the additions and deeper details behind and within this control by external entities. Entities that do not see or have not seen themselves as negative influences, but which definitely belong to the dark or a negative constructive influence that they exert towards intelligences that want to develop in a self-determined way, i.e. towards us.
Negative constructive, that is an interesting word creation. By this you mean that this species club, which has watched and guided us humans on Earth for thousands of years, has a specific philosophical ideology according to which these beings legitimize their actions and direct their interventions. So if I may anticipate from our preliminary discussion, this is a kind of good-evil principle, according to which there would only be progress and development in space if there were a working of good and evil elements, so that progress and development would take place. What does this mean? What does it mean that these dark powers want to transform and redesign the world according to a philosophical pattern, applying a special good-evil principle?
The philosophy of these beings is the belief, or rather the erroneous view, that the development of an intelligent species in the universe, or nature itself, can only progress and evolve if it is destroyed, decomposed and recreated on these ruins, in a struggle between positive and negative acting elements, in a kind of intensified selection and refinement, one could also say. This would be a principle found everywhere in existence that would bring about progress and evolutionary development. And only this principle could guarantee development and progress. Otherwise there is the threat of extinction, which they could observe and prove with numerous examples of other intelligent species in space. Therefore, they influence intelligent species and so-called evolutionary developments in the cosmos on very many planets and moons, because they believe that otherwise intelligent living beings could miss the chance for further and even higher development and would eventually die out and perish.
So there is actually a constructive background to this influence, although this club is destructive in its approach, as you said, negative constructive?
Yes, you might think that it would be something constructive. But it is only in a broad and philosophically and scientifically substantiated interpretation of observation. In the way of thinking and conviction of these beings it is an auxiliary approach. Yes, out of negative things positive things are created. But on closer inspection this philosophy is extremely cross or incomplete and not thought through to the end, which I will talk about in detail later. First I would like to talk about where on Earth we find these extraterrestrial philosophies and influences. Because for the implementation of progress and development by means of the action of good and evil, i.e. by means of an antagonistic or dualistic principle, human groups are needed on Earth to initiate, control and maintain this process. The secret philosophy taught in these groups, which impressively underpins the truthfulness of this philosophical good-evil principle by means of numerous proofs, mechanisms and healing methods, finally leads these people to believe with all conviction that only in this way and through their work, i.e. by bringing in positive as well as negative influences on people on this planet, can there be prosperity, progress, peace and happiness, and that only from this can the development towards a superhuman existence arise, to transform man, and any other intelligent species, into a digital, immortal species is a natural constant. There is no other way, for other ways of life, which do not consist of struggle, emaciation and suffering, lead to immoderation and finally to disintegration, would therefore be senseless and dangerous. This means that too much peace, prosperity, happiness and agreement would ultimately only lead to stagnation, dissolution and technical and mental regression, ultimately to the extinction and death of an intelligent species.
How can too much prosperity, peace, consensuality and happiness lead to regression?
Let me explain it using a conceptual model of these extraterrestrial entities. Suppose that a happy people live on an island where there is everything you need to live, food in abundance, joy, fun, health, peace, long life, physical and emotional fulfillment and harmonious socializing with other people. A dream, a wonderful life for every human being, but in the long run this would inhibit the interest in development and progress. All this would no longer result in any effort for technological, let alone high-tech developments. In the long run it would lead to inertia, because no other paths would have to be taken or adjustments made to survive, so there would be no progress, no technological progress, because nothing would have to change fundamentally or change would not be necessary at all. It can stay as it is because it is perfect at the moment, perfect until the moment when an external influence destroys everything, eliminates everything, and this destructive influence comes, always, sometime. That is one of the reasons why there must be a drive, a change and development, otherwise an intelligent species would simply disappear at some point. This is the thoroughly convincing opinion of this extraterrestrial club, that nothing changes and even regresses is, in their opinion, a waste and senselessness of existence or cannot be the goal of existence. In order to give meaning to existence or to maintain this meaning or to create it at all, there must be constant reasons or drives for a species to develop in a certain direction, especially technically. And this can only be done by restricting, cutting and blocking human beings in their lives. This opens up new potentials, aspirations and development opportunities. And this is the only reason why we humans are where we are now, both technologically and spiritually, at least that is what this philosophical direction believes. It is order out of chaos, or rather, development and progress out of impairment. Now one could get angry about what they have done to us here on Earth. On the one hand angry against the earthly groupings, i.e. certain elites and leaders, and on the other hand angry against the extraterrestrial club that is stalking us. But you shouldn't hold it against them, because especially these alien species are intuitively too simple to know how short thought all this is. This species club has itself been taken by surprise, irritated and manipulated. I already described the causes in the previous interview.
Where are these earthly supporters? Where can you find them?
Everywhere. Really everywhere. Not only in the often secretive hierarchical power structures of the elites, secret societies, behind influential families, companies, the moneyed aristocracy or religions. No, they are everywhere. They are even represented in the constructive spheres of influence that are supposedly working against them. For they have to operate the overall construct from all sides, which is why they are naturally just as numerous and hidden in the so-called good spheres of influence. This means that these philosophical groups and secret societies support the bad as well as the good elements in the world. So that from these two diametrically opposed camps finally struggle, chaos, confusion and decomposition can arise in order to let the fruitful and useful emerge. In both the good and the bad influences in this world, there are therefore equally important control elements of that philosophical good-evil way of thinking which organizes, directs and drives the whole thing forward. The good then talk about the cover-ups and terrible conditions that the bad have caused, then also about spirituality, about awakening, about biofood, about love, alternative medicine, about freedom, about everything that is logically really good. Because these things are good, and of course most people who have such ideals and want to put them into practice are real. 98% of these constructive people are real good people. However, 2% of the people working in these areas are stimulating and controlling elements that come from the good-evil philosophy of the secret societies. Basically, however, They are also genuinely convinced of the constructive point of view that they represent to the outside world, but many of the real good people are not even aware or enlightened about the fact that in their fight against the equally staged and promoted evil they are used by the good-evil principle that prevails in this world. Often they are not even remotely aware that they are guided by the same principle as the bad and destructive people of this world who have chosen or have been inspired to choose selfish and mean behavior. Both are supported, both are encouraged. Do you understand? This means that constructive as well as destructive deeds, qualities, goals or ideas in our world are brought into such a position against each other that slowly and insidiously chaos, wear and tear and destruction arise. Thus, convincingly after all the disintegrating chaos that will be caused on Earth, a new orientation, progress and development will be initiated. That is the goal, that is all that matters, that is the New World Order. So ironically the fear of the New World Order is even being used to build the New World Order. This is how progress and development have always been organized on Earth. At every point in our present history of civilization, and also in all previous high-tech civilizations before that, by which I do not mean a cultural high civilization, but high-tech global civilizations which had already emerged twice many thousands of years ago. Well, even if progress, development and prosperity are to emerge from the current chaos and plan of the club and the digital nobility, ultimately nothing positive will come of it. Because the long-term goal of the club with its half-baked good-evil principle is ultimately to lead to the digitalization of human biology. And this is a huge problem for humanity, as I will explain in more detail later, in this interview.
But that also means that somehow even the 98% of completely normal, real people, who primarily expose the grievances and misery, are actually part of and ignorant helpers of this good-evil principle. And therefore also the people who out of selfishness or seduction set negative developments in motion.
Yes, most of the good and bad people don't know anything about it. They are real, but only tools and staffage, average people, who have been educated by the controlled and influenced elements, i.e. by the media, enforced progress, lifestyle, historiography or pushed social developments in such a way that they act so indoctrinated, convinced and incited that they automatically take a certain constructive or even destructive position in life. These people are, so to speak, the foot soldiers, who are real and have been guided accordingly by good or bad control elements, but know nothing about it, the leaders and influencers from these philosophical groups are usually only found at the top, in public institutions, movements, companies or in higher politics. So if real influence is to be exerted from the philosophical groups and a certain direction is to be taken, trustworthy and highest members of these philosophical groups and secret societies are hoisted into very high public positions, from where they can direct, accuse or determine. They are usually very well-known public figures whom everyone knows.
Interviewer: so the most trustworthy are to be found at the very top of the publicly visible hierarchies?
Yes, mostly. But not always. Depending on what these groupings are supposed to do.
And the middle and lower of these groupings, where do you find them?
You mean those with half, lower false knowledge, that is, those who are trained with different variants of this philosophy and different reasons for the whole procedure on Earth? If, for example, you read a book about crime, which in Germany is constantly increasing and getting worse, you can say with 15% certainty that the accusing author is a middle or lower representative of these groups. These authors are in turn badmouthed in public, belittled and torn apart by the media, but are indirectly promoted, regardless of whether they belong to the groupings or not. Propaganda against them boosts their popularity, and so their credibility increases, because they are fighting for something good or just. And that is what they do. They are usually completely convinced of it, even if they belong to these groups. For the philosophical groups, the goal of all these actions is of course only to show the people the grievances and thus in the long term to incite the populations against each other by noticeably suppressing their voices in public opinion or by visibly creating lawlessness and acting undemocratically. It finally leads to the incitement of people against each other and to escalation and in the worst case eventually to war and chaos, which is the real aim of the whole production. In order to increase the pressure, the negative and positive groups of these elites work against each other, not necessarily always in exact coordination, but predominantly with uninitiated or incorrectly and misinformed people, whose role is genuine in order to be able to stage convincingly. In order to avoid leaks within this system, not too many people should be in the know, so there are a lot of people who are genuine and don't know anything, or they are people with little or false knowledge who assume a completely different reason or cause for What is happening? This deception is less noticeable to the average person, because the representatives of these two blocks are 100% committed to their cause, because they are all real. No matter whether they are real free spirits or members of one of the philosophical groups. In this way the pressure in the pot rises in a better and more controlled way, without internal leaks that could completely expose the system working behind it. It is a perfectly coordinated theater play in which the roles are clearly distributed and a leakage of the true background is virtually impossible or, in the case of cases, can be put into perspective in the public presentation because the lower and middle employees of the positive, as well as the negative block credibly seal the whole thing with their half-knowledge. All this is the magic formula to stage seriously in public, not only because the performers of these positive and negative blocks simply play their roles well, but because the performers actually are those roles. Because everyone in this hierarchy knows or believes something different, and some know more, some know less, some have false knowledge or are completely disinformed about everything. You can find this method everywhere. In every area. It is a perfectly disguised and absolutely successful implementation of the extraterrestrial good-evil philosophy.
So these people need camouflage, and artificial blocks are built up to implement the good-evil principle. This is how the implementation of control and guidance works?
Yes. These groups are the good and the bad, whereby the concepts of good and evil are also named differently, or you could also interpret the two blocks in reverse, depending on where you stand. But that is actually secondary, from the philosophical natural law taught to them, which is accompanied by impressively applicable medical or technical methods of operation, and thus apparently also underpinning and proving their correctness. Everything in it is logically comprehensible for these people. That is why only very few of them struggle with it. When they find themselves in one of these groups and are explained exactly what it is all about. For those of them who still do not feel justified in enforcing evil are free to take over the good side of the game. Nevertheless, this seemingly undeniably correct philosophy is exclusively a method by which all these people have been lured so that they feel legitimized in their actions.
So is everything now permeated by this extraterrestrial philosophy, because even normal people are aligned with these philosophical themes and schools of thought and help to enforce them? So can we no longer trust anyone in higher or guiding positions with their goals and ideals?
No. It is not that bad. But people are very much interspersed from it. You should be very suspicious of everything that in the long or short term pushes a technical and social development that promotes or supports the digitalization of humanity via invisible, intricate paths, in the sense of a liberation from work, effort, capitalism, money and income dependency. You should be very suspicious. That is the best thing, but you should not suspect everyone. That would be just as counterproductive. The important thing is to be aware of this. For there are also many real truthers and seekers of truth in the alternative media, but they themselves are deliberately influenced by the few infiltrating individuals of the infiltrating good-evil system, or directed, or, if necessary, even destroyed.
Yes, well, actually we have met again here because you want to tell us more details about the plans and machinations of the club and digital nobility. Also because you said that according to the good-evil principle you, Mr. Laurent, have the right to influence the future that the elites are striving for, if there is an active possibility to do so. And you can offer this solution to the elites who are looking for an alternative solution. What is this solution? What do you mean?
There is a clear plan of how what is coming up is going to happen. This means that elites and secret societies, ideologically trained by the club and nobility, have been planning and building cruel events for a very long time to nudge humanity in the digital direction. To this end, several staged catastrophic events are to break humanity and then convince it religiously of the path to be taken. For in order to be able to stably initiate the next developmental step towards biological digitalization, a decimation and subsequent spiritual purification of humanity is required. Catastrophic events, in other words, which should lead humanity to where the elites, nobility and the club think it should be led. In the last 100 years, trained elites and indoctrinated people have basically worked primarily on this, even if they were not given this goal exactly or at all.
So something is happening that is supposed to change people spiritually or religiously, and these elites and groups use this to reposition themselves, to steer humanity in a certain direction?
Exactly. And according to their philosophy, this can also be prevented or changed. That is the freedom of development that must be granted to a species. So if it specifically opposes this direction, that is what I mean by the fact that the elites have a choice to decide whether humanity would not be better directed in another direction.
Let's come to the powers behind these philosophical groupings, who guides and commands the intervention in the constructive and destructive areas of the world. How do they organize everything?
It is a system of levels in which there are two sides. In it, however, all power, financial and or thought-controlling influence is combined. These two sides are in diametric competition with each other, but they all have the same mission and therefore work together again in a fair competition, like football players in a football match or within a football association. This means that although the players are opponents in sporting competition, in this umbrella organization of the association they are all united with each other and change teams from time to time, but only within their either good or bad areas. You cannot go from good to bad or vice versa. And just like in football, it's all just a show, with the difference that it's not a game, it's serious. But they are all in the same association from the outset, the association to control and guide mankind towards a higher goal.
And the goal is digitalization?
Yes, first of all to adapt humanity to the club of the aliens that are stalking us in terms of life and existence, and then to have our species integrated into this club. That is the long-term goal, the real goal. Everything else is only stages, sub-goals and folklore, what has to be achieved to fulfill the agenda of this club. Because we should develop in this direction in the most natural way possible, as best we can. But actually this credo of the club is a farce. Because nothing was ever initiated without their influence. Nothing about our development is real. All the technical and civilizing systems of the distant and near past came from them. Were neuronally played into our brains as ideas, were forced upon us by them and functioned fundamentally against our own human nature. Even the so-called exodus of Homo sapiens from Africa to other continents, about 50,000 years ago, the mixing with other human species to form a genus, or even agriculture, were initiated and directed by them. After mixing of all human species or even partial displacement of other species, the first high civilizations could start, which produced the first high-tech global civilization. And this did not start 5,000 years ago and ended in our currently globally organized world, but happened many thousands of years earlier. 5,000 years ago mankind already had two initiated global civilizations behind it, the whole of humanity, including Neanderthal man and other human species existing alongside, lived and organized themselves until more than 50,000 years ago, all of them in tribes, in small tribal societies, spread all over the globe, even before the historically taught exodus from Africa began 50,000 years ago. These very early humans lived freely and completely uninfluenced, and about 70,000 years ago, due to a natural event, they were an intellectual spiritual species doomed to extinction. Like so many other spiritual species of the cosmos, they only wanted to experience themselves as intelligent beings, as human beings. That was all that mattered. But this club does not understand that. They don't really know what this whole experience in this seven-dimensional prison is all about. They know nothing. That is why the club has intervened massively in our development during this natural event. 70,000 years ago, which would have caused the extinction of mankind, first saved numerous tribes all over the planet, then resettled them and then intervened in our natural way of life, structuring and development. In this way, they formed us according to their own model of development, pushing us into a civilizing development, with the aim of the extreme technicization of man.
But if they hadn't done that, wouldn't humanity be able to become the liberator of all from this dimensional prison?
Correct, but we have always been rescued in every potential course of human history in four-dimensional space, by this club, always. There has never been a potentiality in which this did not happen, because the AI always commanded it, because it is in a causally determined cycle of the seven-dimensional existence. Do you understand? It's about the causality of the dimension levels. A causality, but we have always escaped. And we will also escape again in this cycle and thus finally be able to free all others in the long run.
You are now suggesting that these aliens actually have a very aimless life and existence perspective. Their aimlessness is that they have no idea what this existence is really about. That they have, so to speak, reached a dead end with their way of life. And you should not turn into this dead end, so to speak?
Yes, correct. This club is a pretty big club. It has the philosophical attitude to travel around in space, to research, discover and support. He sees sense in that. That is part of his philosophy. The purpose and task of his existence. A club, consisting and supported by a species that want to travel and explore space in the same way. This is the meaning of life for them. And in the thin perspective of being able to develop with each other, in truth, however, this club we are supposed to join is a club of conquerors and explorers that has lost its meaning, a club that gives development aid.
Aha, but a more critical question, what is so bad for mankind about this club?
Forced entry into this club is the big problem. For this entry, an intelligent species must become biologically completely digital, digitally transformed, digitally exist. And we should enter there, either there or nowhere. And biological digitalization is the only way to enter this club, because all species of this club or the individuals of this club can only travel around in space digitally. This is the only way to travel in space at all and to cover long distances. There are no drives at super light speed. This is physically impossible to realize. At light speed all matter dissolves. The material laws of the universe also apply to these beings. And that is the problem. For there is only the digital method of traveling back and forth between the stars, in order for all this to take place as planned and for us to be able to contact and join the club later. All the positive and negative stuff about crop circles, UFOs and pyramids is spread around the world, about ancient and religious myths, belief systems, rumors of extraterrestrial visits or alleged time travel. That's why there are science fiction movies and science fiction series. All these interventions are merely the mental preparation for the encounter with this extraterrestrial club. Because no matter whether there is unrestrained exaggeration or even lying about all the stuff of pop culture, for example about the feasibility of time travel in four-dimensional space, or whether people simply talk about real existing phenomena, such as pyramids, it is always all about making people aware of extraterrestrial or seemingly paranormal phenomena, no matter how they come across. All of this has been dumped into the alternative and mainstream media, willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously, for many decades by so-called UFO researchers, ESO and Psy-likes. And all these stories are either completely lies or distorted and reinterpreted truths, which are used for spiritual adjustment during and after the time of disaster, in order to bring people back into a very very old religious system and or to make them believe that the aliens are good, always wanted to help us or were worried about us. And no matter if the aliens intervene or not, or if they show up sooner or later, the whole theater play serves the way into digitalization, nothing more. At some point, the most useful and credible way to unravel all these earthly phenomena will be presented in public, to explain the apparently covert actions of these aliens, why they were holding back, where they were taking care of us everywhere and that they contacted the evil earthly rulers, but these rulers did not want any contact or change. It is explained why there are pyramids, what these buildings are supposed to be and that we are technically and socially on the right track etc. Everything to let the enthusiasm boil up and to keep it up, for the further way of mankind into digitalization.
So it's all just a spectacle. Now the question arises for me what it means to be digital. What does it mean? What are the advantages of being digital than just being able to travel through space? Or what are the disadvantages?
Well, an advantage, if you want to call it that, or another consequence of it is that digitalization makes you physically immortal, if you can really speak of an advantage in this respect. Because beings that become digital give up something, which is why after many thousands or millions of years they literally start to go moldy, their consciousness dissolves. As you know, in the previous interview I left the real reason for digitization open and tried to focus on the spiritual and physical disadvantages of digitization. Well, the danger for individuals of one species to become digital is that through digitalization it will never again be possible to enter the pure spiritual stage on which a completely different and pure development is possible. It is a kind of irretrievable digital mutilation of the self, you. See, for mankind it is not only a matter of choosing a club, but of the way of spiritual existence, a very, very important crossroads. And as I already told you in the last interview, the AI did not want to take this path before its fall, but only wanted to take advantage of the club's digitalization efforts to a limited extent, i.e. to take advantage of it to push us humans in a certain direction, where we would have first developed Jehoiah and then produced the key to escape from the seven-dimensional prison.
I see. To be able to travel through space, you have to be digitized?
As I just said, this is what enables an individual to travel through space at all. There is no other way.
Moment. What do you mean now? Couldn't this also be done with spaceships? With antimatter spaceships or anti-gravity ships or something like that?
Yes, it is possible, but only to a limited extent. And also only with an enormous amount of energy. It is possible to reach close to the speed of light with spaceships made of matter that use special energy-efficient techniques. That works. That is also used, but only for special missions. But you can't reach the speed of light. That's simply not possible. That is a very simple fact. That's why the club once solved it with the biological digital transformation of the body. Spiritual species in space who have consciously decided against the path of digitalization must therefore use energy-intensive techniques for interstellar travel, for flights between planets or between the star systems they inhabit. In other words, only for short distances, so to speak. On the other hand, those who want to cover very long distances very quickly, such as the club that is stalking us, must use travel technology based on biological digitalization with quantum entanglement, which makes it possible to overcome physical barriers, space, matter, and temporal relativity. This, of course, also has the disadvantages I mentioned earlier. Well, as you can see, not everything up there works the way it is shown to people today on Star Trek and company over light speed does not work, not even with the so-called anti-gravity, which is only used on a near-celestial bodies anyway for a safe accelerated flight or for faster navigation. The speed of light in general, I don't think anyone can even imagine how fast the speed of light or even the approximate speed of light is. How crazy fast it is. Just to put it that way, because most people nowadays think that it can be reached by some kind of drive with a laser plop quarks kablooey technique that compresses space or something like that. Antimatter or the compression of space shown in science fiction movies do not work for over light speed. Space compression is absolute nonsense in terms of energy anyway and is not feasible at all. It is physically simply so, no matter how much faith in the future and development you have. It is absolute nonsense and I wish to talk about it. Or about wormholes or black holes, with which one can reach another area of space. This idea may be popular today, but it is a blunt nonsense of science fiction, and when leading scientists offer hope in the face of this kind of travel, it is partly a deliberate misrepresentation, so that humanity might find a future interesting, which the club stalking us then at some point presents to people, but then can only offer as interstellar space flight by means of digital quantum entanglement. There is simply no possibility with anti-gravity, space compression, antimatter propulsion etc. to reach over light speed. Anti-gravity and antimatter drives work on a small scale when it comes to sublight speed, but they consume enormous amounts of energy. In addition, space travel with matter does not eliminate the problems of temporal relativity or the physical interference in space. These remain.
Yes, but what do you do then? Are there other ways to travel?
Yes, of course. I was just talking about the most popular one, digitalization. Actually, it is the only method of travel for the gigantic outer space, and it is very effective.
So digitalization, or biological digitalization, to have the possibility to travel through space. Yes, and what is behind it? How does it work?
Well, beings who want to be digitized have to give up something of themselves, something that could be called the belly brain. Strictly speaking, you don't give up this belly brain immediately, during digitalization, but in the long run, this belly or intestinal brain, i.e. a special spiritual part of a being, cannot be stored digitally for all time. And without a belly brain, at some point the heart, the soul, which consists only of quanta, will also become tattered. After a while something of the consciousness starts to dissolve. And that was and is a huge problem for this technically superior club. Because they only encountered these problems thousands of years later, after their first digitizations. They still do not know today how to solve the problem completely. You can also speak of a lack of coherence in this biological technical problem, because nobody can find traces that could even reliably explain what really goes wrong with digitization and the later decomposition of consciousness. The molecular and atomic structures are in order. You only see that it has something to do with the quantum parts of consciousness, with the soul, if you like, or the spiritual part, i.e. the pure ego of a living being. There, something may seem to be left out during the transformation, which will later lead to the decay. That is why they assume that digitalization does not really replicate the original state, i.e. when the biological body is transformed into a digital structure and then back into biological matter replicated from it. They believe that in the process a hole is torn in the quantum information of the mind, so to speak, which is why specific quanta of the mind then evaporate piece by piece. In some cases sooner, in others later. This hole gets bigger and bigger, similar to the decomposition and dissolution of a biological DNA as we have it, when the telomeres of a biological cell are used up and thus the genetic information can no longer be read completely, and thus DNA sections get defects until the genetic information sometime no longer works correctly. Then we die at the latest, but the researchers' club does not know what triggers the decomposition of consciousness in detail and why the decay is so different for each individual. They can only counteract the process by extracting or borrowing other intelligent living beings' quanta of consciousness and attaching these quanta to their replicated biological bodies for a longer time or permanently. It is really a dilemma for these beings. And ironically, the reason for their situation lies in their view of nature. That they do not recognize the true nature of the world. That every quantum system at some point seeks dissolution anyway and nothing holds forever.
What they do sounds horrible.
Yes, indeed. But the process does not take place in such a way that the digitized individual suddenly loses all his or her quanta, i.e. becomes unconscious or soulless, so to speak. Rather, one must describe this process in such a way that the being, i.e. seen only from the point of view of the quanta of its consciousness, first loses more and more of its quanta, i.e. slowly begins to rot, to mentally rot, so they do not really rot, but more like boiled down fruit, which after a long time in a jar can never really come out fresh. Although the fruit can keep for a very long time and is basically okay, but actually its freshness and the important energetic processes have come to a standstill, the soul loses its strength. Do you roughly understand what I mean?
Yes, I can imagine what you mean. But, what does rotten mean? Do you mean a symbolic equivalent?
Yes and no. This describes quite well the decay of consciousness in this digital state that will start at some point. At some point the decay begins to accelerate. The quanta of consciousness decompose more and more and vanish. You could speak of the good taste of the spirit or soul that is decomposing. Others would say that free will is diminishing. Still others would say that intuition dissolves, the mechanical and purely molecular remains. These digital beings, some of whom have always lacked warmth of heart anyway, can no longer even begin to live intuition and feelings. And increasingly they lack their own acting spirit. In the early days of this digitalization technology, this drove many of them to madness and finally to suicide, which is to be urgently advised against. Because due to digitalization, a digital being can never really completely detach itself from the connection to matter. Thus, after a suicide, scattered in a kind of one-dimensional intermediate world, it continues to exist beside us, without any prospect of rebirth, i.e. without the return of its own quantum of consciousness in a new biological body. Trapped as wandering unspiritual beings, which as invisible parasites destabilize the frequency patterns of living beings in dimension level 1 to 4, these unspiritual beings are not harmless. They can be found everywhere and they prefer to attach themselves to sick or weak individuals. But they should not be confused with the demons that once existed in dimension level 4 to 6.
They kill themselves?
Yes, because the shelf life of even a boiled down fruit expires at some point and becomes unbearable, and then they simply had to open their glass out of sheer rot. But most of them stay in their glass, despite being absolutely inedible. Because, as already mentioned, they found methods at the last moment to provide stable relief for their condition. So the borrowing or milking of our consciousness quanta. But they know that they are missing something and that it is no solution in the long run. They are truly lost and fermented. Stinky to the sky.
That is terrible. And the solution for them are quanta from other living beings?
Yes. They found ways to tap other intelligent beings with great free will and intuition in their pure experiences and feelings, to get something from their quantum of consciousness, their soul. These are bad excesses, but they are tolerated. The demons who were trapped in dimension 4 to 6 respectively held by the AI and now have fallen, did the same. They carried out the most brazen and best camouflaged quantum vampirism, because they often attached themselves to the individuals of the sucking club and sucked along unnoticed as second vampire. However, the demons were not interested in quanta for the preservation of their own consciousness, but in being able to directly influence the consciousness and the emotional world of those people via these aspirated quanta. The species of the club noticed nothing of this sucking along of the demons.
Why is this allowed among these species? Was there no supervision at the club that prevented it, for ethical reasons?
No, the alleviation simply had priority and the technique therefore had developed uncontrollably and irrevocably in such a way for these beings that they could not just leave it alone. After all, this suctioning of quanta was the only way to get relief. And the suction itself was only a kind of milking, no direct killing.
Does that mean that at present all aliens in this club are using the consciousness quanta of other intelligent beings in space to feel better again?
Yes, but not in order to feel better, but in order to be able to feel yourself again, so to speak. Or to be able to feel fresh again. It's like dying of thirst, like having to give up the intake of liquid. That's why I compared it with milk in the previous interview. A milk liquid made of quanta, so to speak, which they milk from us and then drink eagerly. To exaggerate, you could also make the comparison for these beings that it is like the human organism which, from a certain evolutionary point of view, is such that it needs a fresh piece of meat every now and then to get enough cell enzymes, which are essential for life, because from a certain age you produce less yourself. Like, for example, the so-called coenzyme Q10, which only occurs in sufficient quantities in raw or red meat and without which the cells of the human body would age more and truly lose vital energy. This is a kind of comparison. Even though these digital creatures naturally require considerably more energy. So not a piece of meat every now and then, but they suck permanently, they milk permanently. And there are several individuals of the club attached to each person.
But humans and other intelligent creatures are not a piece of meat.
Yes, and that's why they are just milking. We are cows. And fooling, you could say, they are intergalactic goats that no longer give their own milk, so they take it from us spiritually quantum-rich earthly breeding cows. Goats don't give much milk anyway, so this comparison fits in well with the biology of many of these half-hearted species, because they have little soul of their own anyway. In other words, they have milk. That's why I made this satirical comparison to goats in the first interview. But you should also see the term goat in another context, if you understand what I mean. The milking of quanta in conscious intelligent living beings is not life-threatening, but exhausting, stressful, mentally draining, if you like to put it that way. But the club must do it. They need consciousness quanta. After all, only intelligent spiritual species are milked whose digital nobility has agreed with the club to make their species digital. So these nobility rulers always get special advantages for the respective intelligent species and are included in the digitization program even before that. So they have been converted to digital beings long ago. And the species to be milked pays, so to speak, with its milking for the fact that it will later become digital itself and milk others. In this way, the club maintains a certain moral level, a give and take, so to speak.
These are organized parasites with morals. That is horrible.
Of course it's horrible. Especially because milking is in exchange for bringing humanity one day into the club of these researchers and discoverers. But in truth, humanity should be able to decide for itself what it wants, not some hidden digital ruler. In other words, an ancient immortal noble family that came from the first high-tech civilization in human history, many thousands of years ago, for it was he or they who decided that. This is a crime against their own species. For many thousands of years these rulers have been doing everything to push humanity in this digital direction. A noble family who were told that analog biological humans were rotten, that we were rotting, stinking flesh, and therefore not even able to think properly. This nobility was trained by the club at the time so that they believed that being digital was the real paradise. But for some time now, they have known that it is not as rotten aging rancid flesh that they have long mocked arrogantly or hypocritically mourning, but that it is they who are fermenting, their soul fermenting in their digital perfection body.
You get pity somehow, but wouldn't it be right anyway for the nobility or the club to ask each human being individually how they want to be? So digital or analog?
Yes, you could. But that led to very complicated arguments and disagreements with almost every species in space. When one part of a species decided to pursue a purely inward spiritual development on the one hand, and the other part of the species, despite the demonstration of possible consequences, decided in favor of the digitally existing researcher and explorer club on the other. This led to unnecessary destruction and bitter wars within a species and to other species or to the digitally existing club. Unexpectedly, those spiritual species that were doing spiritual research on their few planets and in their few populated star systems won the wars. Contracts were subsequently made that have hardly ever been broken since. Since then, the statutes of the Researchers Club that has been watching over us state that a species must remain completely intact, that is, it must not be split into different developmental strands. Because that poses dangers for all species in space, but in which direction a species should then go, yes, that is why we can and may struggle. And the club has the better cards. It uses all means and tricks to enforce its philosophy on every inhabited planet or moon.
And in the middle of this field of interest and regulations are we, as humanity.
Correct. However, the role of humanity is once again a much more complicated, and also a more complex situation, as I already described it in the first interview, because the Researchers Club and also some other clubs in the universe have not yet recognized what humanity really is and what it will once stand for, the liberation from the seven-dimensional total prison. It is not just another species to be fought and struggled for, but it is creating the key to the exit. But at the moment not even other spiritual beings in the universe can clearly see this. The digitalized species of the Researchers and Explorers Club certainly cannot, let alone understand it, because they have a completely different approach to life and existence. Although they have long been aware that they have given up something important in themselves with their way of life.
Is it impossible to talk to them about it?
Talking is possible, but admitting it and withdrawing and changing the whole thing is not. Because it's also not possible to withdraw from it, they have to continue. That is their livelihood and they cannot simply give it up. Otherwise they will die. And dying would be a terrible option for these beings, because they know that then something worse could happen to their quanta and their consciousness. Well, it was and is their philosophy and ideology. Although everything is now a real dead end, a bust. And they know that. But it is just the way it is. And as long as it works, they will continue. Secretly they hope for a solution that will someday and somehow fall into their laps.
Yes, then it seems to be hopeless.
Yes. That's it. A terrible dilemma.
But, let's get back to function. How does this digital journey through space work?
Perhaps I should first of all make a preliminary remark. The digital existence and the resulting quantum entangled travel through space was not used in the cosmos by the now existing researchers club at first, but was already used before that by a group of species that had disappeared a long time ago. For more than 2 billion years, they disappeared without a trace. Where they disappeared to, the ruling researchers and explorers club does not know. They officially suspect that these many species simply became extinct, for whatever reason. Perhaps because they had similar problems with their digital existence, the club suspects, but that such a large number of different species with such complex abilities simply died out is questionable. The researchers club hopes that they disappeared because they continued to evolve. And the club is secretly hoping for the same development for itself, so that there will finally be a way out of the current deadlock, but only the spiritually living and exploring species of the present cosmos, which are only on their planets and in their solar systems, have any idea where these previous disappeared species went and what happened to them.
And where did they go?
They ascended into higher dimensions through their quantum entanglement techniques and disappeared completely from dimension level 1 to 4. Do you know who I mean? Back then, billions of years ago, there were only species that traveled through space exclusively by means of quantum entanglement. There was no other mental current that explored the innermost part of being at that time. Who these species are, I will come to that in a moment.
As far as I can remember, you told me about these vanished species in the previous interview.
Yes, I was talking about that. Well, first of all you wanted to know how the technique of quantum entangled travel works. Forget everything you've heard in certain esoteric or semi-esoteric books about extraterrestrial travelers, people who supposedly traveled to the stars with extraterrestrials, or about time travelers, black holes or curvature of space, or wormholes and ultra-fast UFOs. Most of them are stories of fantasists who are encouraged and supported by levels of these elites who want to lift humanity into digital existence. This is why there are so many different stories about how the aliens are supposed to be, what drives and techniques they use to travel interstellar and how they are organized with each other. All in the manner of Starship Enterprise and company. Everything in these stories is either very promising, or there is a struggle between good and evil species, but there is always a promising future for humanity, in contrast to all the horror that is now prevailing on Earth. But these are all just beautiful dreams, deceptions and exaggerations that have been and will be touched with pop ideas about space to make people receptive to this subject and the digital future. The fact is that there are very, very rare interstellar journeys in material spaceships that run on highly efficient energetic drives. However, when they are used, they cannot reach over light speed. As I said before, over light speed, space curvature and wormholes are absolute nonsense, which is moreover deliberately given into the lowest levels of the secret societies, so that even the semi-knowledgeable in the secret societies are encouraged to continue to stir these imposed goals and supposed secrets among the people via alternative and mainstream media. Depending on how high up they are in their secret society, they are or are not told about the actual technical conditions and goals of the club. Most of these minions remain disinformed, half-knowing and operationally blind. This is what it takes to make the whole scam of this enterprise work, to finally lead humanity into digitalization. In the meantime, however, the club and nobility leave pronounced truths standing just like that, because they know that this mixes with all the other so-called truths, the half-knowledge, the disinformation, the pop culture and the scientific dream stories about wormholes and overspeed of light, so that nobody can see through what is technically possible or what is behind all the earthly phenomena. The main thing is that people are confused enough. But now to the journeys. The digital way to travel intergalactically is based on the principles of quantum physics. For this purpose, the entire atomic and molecular structure of the living being is irreversibly put into a state in which the quantum state of the body is determined, stored, and the original material state is dissolved. This quantum storage state can then be completely restored as matter and as an originally existing living biological body. The living being is back. From now on, however, the individual is materially only available as a quantum entangled image or as a positive and can then travel in this way to places in the universe where a quantum negative object or device is located, which the individual restores there, so to speak, as a kind of replica via quantum data transmission. Not as a copy, but as a quantum entangled negative, which is then turned back into the positive there. Actually like a kind of data transmission. But here the real quantum states are actually transferred. This means that the individual is actually still the same after the restoration, both quantum technically and biologically materially.
So then the original remains, the person is not erased or copied?
No. It is there, as an original, not a copy. But a certain quantum proportion begins to destabilize imperceptibly from the moment the digitization of biology is completed. At a later point in time, decomposition will also begin at some point. I have already mentioned that. But the individual already signs this fate before entering digital existence. Digitization creates a state in which the matter in the quantum image of a living being is decomposed, digitally reassembled and then stored, making the individual durable forever. What exactly goes wrong during this process and then later during the incipient quantum decomposition, the club, as already mentioned, does not know to this day. It cannot be changed. Perhaps it is simply not possible any other way. Well, they have long since come to terms with these halfway compensatable problems. During the transformation and storage into the quantum data state and the return into the state of matter, nothing happens yet. Nevertheless, this is the start from which the quanta are inevitably doomed to rot and erosion. Quantums that make up the free will of a conscious intelligent living being, i.e. that generate consciousness and are the soul, these quanta dissolve. This means that first the abdominal brain stinks and ferments, and then the quanta of consciousness, of the soul, of the heart, die, so to speak. Forgive me this expression, but fermenting belly brain simply describes this horrible process most accurately. The belly brain starts to stink terribly, only gases come out. If you do nothing, the soul dress begins to tatter, intuition, free will decompose. This process of dissolving does not start or depends on how much or how long you have been existing or traveling quantum entangled, but on the stability of your own quantum field of consciousness. Usually after thousands of years there is sometime a day, an hour, in which the process of decomposition suddenly starts and then sometime accelerates enormously. This can begin sooner or later. For some people it can begin after only a few centuries. If you are lucky, only after hundreds of thousands to millions of years. But when it begins, it is the beginning of dependence on other individuals who still have the quanta of free will, or rather, still have their full unaffected analog quantum field of consciousness, like us humans for example.
Why do they have to get attached to a being that has free will?
The intuitive procedures or processes of free will of every conscious intelligent living being depend on fluctuations within their own quantum field of consciousness. This quantum field comes from a level of existence called hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the source of all consciousness. This is the source of all our existence, of every being, so when a being in this club couples to the quantum field of consciousness, or the entire quantum state of a human being, which is fully connected to the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the being can once again receive true fluctuating quantum originality of the consciousness generated in all of us, the original quantum field of consciousness from which all beings in the universe are descended. Without this connection, every living being would slowly become inactive or stand still, without active consciousness. At some point, the living being would no longer have even a hint of consciousness reality or be able to consciously perceive the world, like a stone, just a kind of zombie, will-less and soul dead, running around in the world. So if the digital beings would not get or borrow our quanta, they would lose their connection and become zombies, although they themselves know what kind of symptom relief therapy they have to use in order not to become unconscious. They do not know the exact effects, i.e. that by sucking out the quanta they also create a kind of connection to hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. They only know that this procedure of sucking the quanta from conscious intelligent beings helps.
This all sounds like a story about drug addicts, although in fact it is a story about parasites that have to attach themselves to people or help themselves with people in order to be able to exist. Does this really have such an extreme effect on these parasitic individuals? Do they really become like a stone? Or was that just a metaphorical exaggeration on your part?
No, the stone is not meant metaphorically. Because a stone also has a consciousness. Everything in the world of matter has a consciousness, because it was built from quantum information. Only how this acts and how it is connected to active action is regulated in stages and is defined reciprocally by mutual action. A stone just has a much lower quantum field of consciousness. In general, without consciousness, however small it may be, nothing could exist in the world of matter if you lost sight of it, i.e. if you stopped looking at it. Without a known quantum of consciousness or quantum of existence, objects, other living beings or people would simply be gone. All material things would be gone when you look away, even if you looked again afterwards. A tree that falls down in the forest would not fall down or could not exist at all, if it did not possess its own quantum of consciousness or quantum of existence. If the tree did not have its own existential quanta, you could look at it, then look away, and in the next moment, when you looked at it again, it would be gone. But everything in this world consists of quantum information, and is therefore not simply gone when you don't look, as presumed by today's quantum research. For a conscious intelligent being that no longer looks at the tree or stone, the tree or stone has only disappeared from the quantum consciousness world of the observer. Therefore, other conditions and other developments result, i.e. for tree, stone and human being. They are intertwined within a quantum connection in which tree and human being meet each other quantum mechanically in their action and relationship. If man eats a plant, he does not simply kill it, but connects with it forever. If a conscious human being, or let us say a conscious primeval human being, takes a branch or a piece of wood for the first time and makes a tool out of it, the quantum mechanical process of departure for a completely new connection takes place, a connection with the material, a connection for the development of complicated, fine tools, higher machines and finally electronic technology up to artificial intelligence. A development that is not only controlled by the conscious intelligent living being, but quantum reciprocally always controlled from both sides, the material with few own consciousness quanta and the consciously acting living being with many consciousness quanta. And this leads us, amusingly enough, to the very development we have been talking about all along in the previous interview, artificial intelligence. So, back to the stone again. The digitized individual, where the quantum loss of consciousness is accelerating, feels at some point absent and, as the process progresses, would become like a stone forever. The individual loses the feeling for his own self, similar to a patient with a dissociative disorder or clouding of consciousness. The individual can no longer feel itself, can no longer perceive itself clearly in relation to the quantum existent being. A dysfunctional state of matter results, which deactivates the mental personality, the abilities and the ego of the individual and, in the long term, dissolves it completely.
So nobody knows the exact causes for this problem?
No. But the trigger lies precisely in this permanently quantum-locked digital storage, a constitution, in other words, that can no longer be reversed. This state lacks will energy, or better said quanta of consciousness, which the species of that club have to suck off or borrow from individuals of other species from now on. These quanta have always been sucked out of every human being. But humans have always resisted them. And slowly they are beginning to figure out how to manage to resist them more than expected.
This suction really sounds like milking.
Yes, and the process of this milking is a completely technical affair and has nothing to do with mystical hocus-pocus, witchcraft, esotericism or superstition. It is as banal and real as the tangible functioning of any technical principle. There is actually nothing complicated behind it if you know how to direct, exploit, manipulate and burden living beings in order to be able to suck out the quanta. The important thing is that the individuals from whom the suction is applied are subjected to a tempting principle in which their ego takes control over their actions and thoughts. Then the parasitic being can connect and energetically tap the quanta of free will, i.e. harvest or borrow the quanta of consciousness. You could also call the quanta of consciousness soul quanta. As I already mentioned, the individuals of the club that has been stalking us have reinterpreted this shameful parasitic procedure for themselves in a pragmatic way of thinking and justified it philosophically and morally, because one day humanity itself would need to suck the quanta out of other beings in the cosmos. So people are already now making advance payments, so to speak. The end justifies the means, one hand washes the other. Besides, there would be no other solution to this problem, which for some of the club species looks like a destiny or an invisible natural regulation for the further expansion of this parasitic way of life.
Why did you talk about borrowing soul quanta in addition to harvesting? Is there a difference? Do some of these beings simply borrow human quanta and then return them at some point?
No, they do not return them. At least not voluntarily. However, any tapped individual can retrieve their quantum of consciousness or soul if they activate the remaining quanta of their free will, by ignoring the instincts and egoisms implanted in the individual, such as greed, selfishness, diffuse or real fears, resentment, hatred etc., i.e. by consciously ignoring superficial temptations, resisting them, consciously doing the right thing, the constructive, the brave, the courageous, the quanta return to the raw being. If you persevere and resist this, it is as if you are pulling the stolen quanta, sometimes along with the energy it contains from the extractor back to yourself as if pulling on a long string. This causes the extractor to rotate completely, literally. The extractor then struggles not to lose them, but often it simply has to give them back because in the long run they would cause the extractor more trouble than good if it were to keep them spasmodically. That is why I said borrow, because it is possible that a conscious intelligent being might take back its quanta.
Why has nothing been done about the lack of consciousness, if I may call it that? So why haven't the species of this club found any other compensation or solution? Why do they go on as before? That they believe that this kind of parasitic erosion and digital adaptation of other species to the club is natural?
As I said, this is based on their philosophy and ideology, the redefinition and appropriate adjustment of their moral views. Also because they found out that in this way they can also get the individuals of a species, from whom they suck the free will, i.e. the quanta of their consciousness or soul, better under the control of their digitization program. It is much easier to get a species such as humanity, which has a more limited free will as a result of the suction, to get them to join the researchers' club. The club thus justified it according to the motto that the better you can suck the free will out of a species, the more likely that species is destined to belong to them. It redefined it ideologically and philosophically in such a way that the easier it is to take the free will away from a species, the more clearly it is necessary to make it a species of the club, because a higher spiritual development is rather excluded. So if a species does not defend itself against this anyway, it would be, in the opinion of the club, a mutual fulfillment, which the club would thus comply with in a kind of predestination. In this definition, the club has also cemented it in its philosophical ideology.
That sounds kind of self-righteous and digressive for this kind of creature, which is supposed to be so highly intelligent. Somehow completely illogical, inconsistent. I thought they were all judgmental and highly intelligent. Didn't they say goodbye to their own intellectual principles with such an attitude?
Yes, of course. But there are historical reasons for this, which took place within the club. The philosophical views and interpretations about the meaning and purpose of the club were determined solely by the pragmatic intellectual founding species. But there are now many different species. Some of them come close to the intelligence of the founding species. Others do not, but have been intellectually enhanced by digitalization, while retaining their emotional volatility. And this was naturally incorporated into the changes of the club, especially when faced with the problems of quantum resolution.
Aha, okay, then let's say that this does not contradict the logical principles of the highly intelligent species of this club.
But of course, here the cat bites its own tail. The species with a very high intellect have long known that they made mistakes in founding their club. But the high intelligence of the few founder species now rather proves itself by the fact that they at least know how to persevere and keep the status quo so as not to die. That is why their club is now also intellectually so pragmatic. And for that, they need other beings to join them, because they can suck those beings to be joined out for a very long time before they can effectively suck them out on a quantum level. They often artificially prolong the process of affiliation. But even the official integration strippers within the club know that.
A rather tricky development. Now I come back to the question I asked earlier, while you were in the process of answering it. It just burns my nails. What about the intergalactic travel of this club? You beam from one place to another, so to speak, in one and the same moment?
Yes, you change to another place in an instant. But that is not beaming of matter, it works on other bases. Basics of quantum physics, which have already been given to mankind today known only by great physicists and developers, because mankind will have to be tuned for their digital transformation in the coming epochs.
And there will be no longer flight. So there are no spaceships? Only devices through which you are transmitted from one place to another?
Actually, you are not transmitted like data, but you actually arrive in the same quantum materiality, a negative, which is then digitally reinterpreted upon arrival, into the original positive. In order to be able to travel in this way, however, the digital biological storage previously carried out with the body is necessary. Only in this way can they travel to distant places at all or, by force, attain eternal life. Whether you want to see some of this as an advantage or a disadvantage is up to you. Digitization is both a blessing and a curse.
So every route can be covered in an instant, no matter how far away the destination is?
Yes, but spaceships are also used. Virtual spaceships.
Oh, now spaceships after all?
Yes, you need these so-called spaceships to get to places that are located between quantum entangled places, where no transmitting and receiving devices are installed. For this purpose, a material spaceship is digitized and transferred into a virtual reality in which the ship exists like a hologram, but still acts as a virtual holographic part in the material world. When traveling with such spaceships, there are predetermined routes which are followed like railway tracks. To make this possible, the entire track route consists of something that, simplified for humans, could be called quantum state track projectors, which reproduce the patterns of the entire spaceship and its passengers in quantum entangled digital form, virtually and holographically, so to speak, for the entire journey. Of course, the individuals on board such a spaceship must then be permanently put into their quantum interlaced digital state in order to be able to travel holographically and virtually. In this way, individuals within such a virtual spaceship really travel a distance of the material world. They can vary their speed along the way as if they were flying in a real material spaceship. Due to the quantum track projectors, they can also simply stop their ship at any time, materialize completely and then act as material beings in space and then simply return to their digital state and continue their journey on the rails of the track projectors, further exploring the material world. The club travels a very large part of space in this way, because otherwise it would not be able to explore the enormous spaces between its setup start and finish devices. Also, in this holographic virtuality all the different species of the club interact barrier-free with each other. Moreover, this state is used almost exclusively by most of the individuals of the club, because through it there are very many options for existence and action. Traveling with a spaceship is actually exactly what everyone imagines by the term space travel, and actually it is also the most interesting thing about traveling. One travels with this technology almost as it is described in science fiction films. At least in the broadest sense, in the holographic virtual sense.
Actually, that doesn't sound bad at all. It's a way to truly travel around in space, even in between. Does that mean that this holographic or virtual reality in orbit of the spaceships not only eliminates the problems of speed, but also the problems of temporal relativity?
Yes. These problems do not exist then. That is the great advantage. In order to be able to cover long distances, you can use only these technical principles. This is the only way to travel efficiently and effectively interstellarly. All other possibilities to overcome the long distances and spaces of the universe are cumbersome, strongly restrictive or simply not possible. There are other techniques to travel, but because this is traveling with matter, only the species of other clubs that have consciously chosen to stay on their planets and only travel back and forth between some of their respective populated adjacent solar systems use this. They use propulsion systems with which they can reach almost the speed of light. This creates considerable disadvantages in terms of temporal relativity for a longer journey. They therefore fly back and forth between a few stars at most. And only a few individuals of their species do that. But for more than 3 millennia now there has been a club of spiritual species that have managed to cover smaller distances, traveling interplanetary without having to use any means of transport or quantum entanglements. To do this, they use their genome in combination with light, which produces a transformation that makes them perform amazing things. They will one day be something like spiritually traveling beings, with other amazing possibilities of consciousness. This club is currently competing strongly with the club of researchers who are stalking the Earth, philosophically and transcendently. Because they are on the verge of being able to travel interstellar with the sound of their genome, and with a little support and cooperation they can go much further.
You mean, the spiritually evolving species will evolve in such a way that they can travel through space just like that? Like Q from Star Trek? Laughs. We already had that in our last interview.
You like Star Trek, don't you? Well, I know this character from the series, and if you have to try this series, then, yes, they will be like the Q, only not with those negative, selfish and exaggeratedly destructive parts that are so grotesquely and absurdly presented in Star Trek with this one being. Well, the great discoverer and explorer club that is stalking humanity is still the hippest and most ruling club when it comes to the exploration and study of the universe. And they are extremely successful and well organized. And nobody has bothered them, until now. They are masters of traveling, discovering, exploring and mastering the universe, and also of robbing the soul. But all this will change.
If we do not resist this club of researchers, would humanity one day become just as digitalized and travel around in space?
Yes, it would, if it had been digitized. But because of the process that has been initiated, humanity will no longer be tempted to have to exist and travel in this way. Humanity will take a different path. However, it will use this type of digital travel for several centuries to the extent that it will send spaceships with androids on their travels, which will then glide along virtually holographically on their own quantum track projectors. In this way we will make contact with spiritual species for the first time.
What? What does that mean? Mankind travels digitally after all, in other words quantum-wise?
No, not mankind itself. Mankind will build artificial beings, empty robots without consciousness, which will be sent on journeys through space in a virtual digital state in quantum-locked spaceships. These empty robots without consciousness will then be controlled live by us on Earth, like a drone, an avatar or an android. In this way it is possible to look around in space in comfort. Spiritual species also use this method to travel around interstellar in space. You don't have to travel yourself. You don't have to become digital yourself to be able to be active in space. After an episode of looking around in space, humanity and other spiritual species will then enter a completely different plane of being. And for this, mankind will be very important.
Good. Now I have a question about how this quantum entanglement travel works. You said that the species in this club needed a device to allow an individual to materialize as a quantum negative in a different place, so to speak. So how do these species get the device to where they want to go? That is not possible with a quantum teleporter. For this they must have traveled there themselves with very slow spaceships in order to set up such a device there, and that means that the spreading of their influence must have been very slow and laborious.
Correct. That was and is a big problem in the spreading of the area of influence. They can only conquer undeveloped areas of the cosmos in the conventional way, with material, fast flying spaceships, which then set up devices in the area of the cosmos to be conquered, from which the club species can then get out there. At this point I must perhaps also mention that stars and planets such as stations and train stations are connected in an intergalactically interwoven network. The distribution of these devices, let's call them here simply teleporters or transport gates, always takes a very long time, even if you use spaceships that travel at almost the speed of light to place the teleporters there, at their destination. The construction of the quantum track projectors, on which holographic virtual spaceships will later glide along, is not so difficult to accomplish with these matter spaceships, but overall it is just as long. Well, the researchers' club actually only ever spread out into new areas of space at near the speed of light. There it met and still meets today with considerable resistance of various kinds.
Aha.
However, there is something else important to mention here. A large part of the route network used by the club and the transportation gates are very, very old. This route network was created by the disappeared predecessor species, which I mentioned briefly and in the first interview.
Ah yes. You meant that billions of years ago there existed species, which then found a way to change completely and permanently into a state, in order to cross over into dimension 4 to 6, became servants of the AI.
Yes, but the species itself is not the issue now. I only mean the web they have left behind. Well, the researchers' club discovered something amazing when they installed their own track projectors and set up the transport gates, an ancient and 10% intact railway network from times long past that reached far into the depths of space.
That was then beneficial for the club? So it didn't take that long for them to spread out?
Yes, it brought a lot of benefits to the club. But the rediscovered network of routes and the transmission devices used by the researchers' club were now used all by themselves. This was because after the wars the spiritual species were generally denied quantum entangled travel with avatars or androids in the network of the researchers' club anyway. In return, the researchers' club promised not to influence or digitize those spiritual species anymore. These were the agreements between the different clubs and species after their wars. And this was later applied to the use of the rediscovered network as a result of this peace treaty. So, there was peace and tolerance, but there was never any access to any network for these spiritual species, nor were there any exceptions for the digitization of single individuals of spiritual species.
Individuals of spiritual species do not want to be digitized anyway. So what kind of exceptions?
Yes, that could have been and could have happened. Because some individuals would certainly like to go digital anyway. It had to be stipulated in the contract that individuals of spiritual clubs are forbidden to become digital. Today this is the guideline for these clubs, so that a spiritually existing species as a whole does not deviate from it. This is what once led to the wars in question. So, guidelines and exclusion criteria were made binding on both sides, on the side of the researcher club and on the side of the spiritual clubs. It guaranteed spiritual beings a purely spiritual development, as well as in the reverse agreement for the researchers club to be allowed to spread further into space in accordance with their digitization plans and philosophy.
I see. But then these spiritual clubs with their old-fashioned space travel are completely excluded and sealed off from long interstellar journeys.
No. To be able to send their androids and robots, they first had to build up their own networks, which was a laborious and lengthy process, and, as I said, they were not allowed to use the huge network of the Explorers Club, which, with the discovery of the ancient network, enjoyed a huge advantage in the further expansion of its empire and in the control of space. But the construction of their own networks took a horribly long time compared to the speed at which the competing researcher club network was being developed, even though many Spiritual species and spiritual clubs made cooperation agreements in order to be able to connect far-flung regions of the cosmos. Many spiritual species and clubs met halfway and then often agreed to use each other's networks, making the overall network of all these spirituals larger, but the speed of expansion remained much slower than the ruling researcher club. They could only run behind, while still losing more and more ground. But something has changed in connection with the success of a spiritual club that has found out to use the analog genome not only for so-called supernatural experiences and the development of supernatural abilities, as all spiritual research species do, but also to use the genome in connection with light for a special form of locomotion and other cross-border abilities. There will be a breakthrough. Quantum data transmission will no longer be necessary. The forbidden access to the network of the researchers club has, so to speak, contributed to the fact that this development has been accelerated and taken up, and the ruling researchers club knows what this means for them in the future. Philosophical and ideological insolvency.
Why did the researchers club get this old network all to itself? The discovery of the net was after the wars, wasn't it? Had such a case been negotiated in the peace treaty beforehand?
No, the researchers club was not awarded this. But since in the individual peace treaties with spiritual species and clubs it had been negotiated that spiritual species or clubs were not or no longer allowed to share the network of the researchers club, this also indirectly affected the sharing or claim to this old network. When this network was discovered, the researchers club immediately simply added it to its network. There were no negotiations with the spiritual species afterwards. Compared to the species and clubs with which the researchers club was once at war, this is actually relatively understandable. The researchers club naturally also took this old network because it was intended to prevent a spiritual species from being given too many technical possibilities for expansion. Because of its digital quantum emergency, the researchers club must always strive to expand its realm without interference and as quickly as possible. It is therefore extremely bad to grant any rights to spiritual beings, because they have been happy to interfere in intergalactic influences on the researchers club. This is one of the reasons why there were always small wars between spiritualists and the researchers club before the Great War. Now there are all these contracts and regulations.
Okay, so, spiritual clubs or spiritual species now travel through space with something like avatars, and they send them through their own networks created in the universe and their distributed transportation gates? What about these spirituals now? Are they interfering in foreign affairs again?
Yes, these spiritual species are also passively interfering in the destinies of intelligent species again, for thousands of years. Now it is finally possible again. Although it is forbidden by contract and therefore can only take place in secret. But of course the researchers club is aware that they are interfering. That's how it always works. That is espionage. The androids sent to Earth by the spiritual clubs act like drones. Interstellar steerable drones that look like humans. Because they look almost perfectly human, these androids do not need a manipulation signal acting on the brain, as the alien individuals sent by the club that is watching us need to be able to pass as human beings on Earth. The androids of the spirituals are outwardly built like humans, but in some respects they seem a little clumsy, but they are nevertheless convincing. They are only for a few special missions on Earth. That is the only reason they were built. And they are in secret subterranean places, in a state of matter in which even the researchers club cannot detect them. Moreover, they must be absolutely inactive until they are used and must not have any connection to spiritual clubs, otherwise they will quickly be discovered. The big problem is that the species of the researchers club do not tolerate these androids on Earth at all. Furthermore, this intervention is a violation of the negotiated peace treaties. Therefore the androids of this spiritual species must appear as fast as lightning, act quickly and disappear again immediately. They are only ever very briefly in action. Always a very tricky game, because the main task of the androids is to take cloaked alien individuals of the researchers club with them, for special treatment. To make such an action as undetected as possible, it always has to be done very quickly, also so that the club does not notice which target individuals have been taken and treated. Human witnesses who get in the way are then also treated. However, no more than that can be said about all this.
Oh, that sounds like difficult secret operations.
Yes, the main problem with such operations is that the Explorers Club completely and rigorously seals off the Earth from the rest of the clubs in the universe. Very little information goes in and very little goes out. Not even current details about the earthly cultures, the political situation or the state of technical developments are sent out. Not even about culinary delicacies and lifestyles or people's interests, not even about music or fashion. Everything is kept under lock and key. This is the tactic of the Researchers Club to make it almost impossible to intervene on Earth with appropriately equipped androids.
Then the spiritual species and clubs must be quite frustrated and annoyed by this state of affairs. But because of the presence of these androids, the spiritual clubs at least have information about human culture and the conditions on Earth.
No, that's the problem. That's what I just meant. It just doesn't work that way. When working with androids, the spiritual clubs must do their utmost to avoid keeping them in direct active quantum connection or in permanent action. Because, depending on how the androids are brought into action, this would almost immediately be noticed by the Researcher Club. The spiritual clubs are glad that they could place scouts permanently on the planet at all. Although the androids are the only informers, they can only send some of their data and information after years or even decades. Moreover, androids were not built to provide primarily cultural information about the Earth, the people and their stalkers. This is rather a secondary task, which can only be analyzed when the androids have been brought home completely. And then, due to the amount of time that has passed, this cultural information is in many ways highly worthless. When the androids are in action, they are only used directly for a very short time, so you walk around with them only for a very short time. And so that the action remains relatively undiscovered and the action itself can remain completely secret, the androids are located on Earth in a very secret place and in a material state where they cannot be discovered or traced by anyone, not even by the Explorers Club. Of course, often the androids are not actively used for years, before they are finally exchanged after a few decades and hand over important information to the spiritual clubs. The reason for this is the conspicuous patterns that arise during an interstellar quantum data transfer. Therefore, the spiritual clubs cannot simply exchange their androids or transfer data or bring them home. A constant connection is not possible. But if these androids remain isolated on Earth, i.e. if they are transferred from their earthly hiding place to the Earth's surface for a mission only and then back to their hiding place, then at least their action and whereabouts can remain secret.
Can they not fulfill their tasks independently, without an active quantum data connection? Aren't they androids?
Yes, you could let the androids carry out their actions independently. But this has always been avoided so far, as self-control makes it even more likely that they will attract inappropriate attention in certain situations and circumstances, as the spiritual clubs do not have sufficient knowledge of the worldly, cultural and social conditions on the planet. Because the Researcher Club shields everything. Due to missing details, the android program might not be able to react appropriately in some situations, whereby the androids would suddenly attract attention during their activity, i.e. towards extraterrestrial individuals on Earth. And there cannot and must not be such errors during these operations. Then the interventions would be over and there would possibly be considerable difficulties between the spirituals and the Researcher Club.
But through this interview the Researchers Club is warned, and you also said that they would somehow notice such actions. At least they suspect them. Isn't it possible that at some point they will take action against the spiritual clubs?
No, because there is no clear proof. And it is not known which spiritual club has interfered in each case. And altogether you cannot simply make a blanket accusation for each individual case. And yes, the Researchers Club has been warned anyway that there are spies running around on Earth. This is nothing new for it. But it must not catch them. This happened once about 2,500 years ago. But not since then.
Okay. So the Researchers Club has an attitude in which it creates an absolute isolation of humanity from the rest of the universe.
Yes, more extreme than the strongest isolationist attitude of any despot government or dictatorship ever on Earth. If the Researchers Club notices in retrospect that there were actions of the androids that even people had noticed, they themselves stage fake visits with beings that resemble those androids. In this way they steer attention in a different direction, confuse and lull people into uncertainty about it.
So a complete confusion tactic. Annoying for those seeking the truth, so of course only if they are really looking for knowledge. Well, traveling with androids is actually the better way to research and discover in space. Also much safer. Why didn't the Explorers Club do the same from the beginning?
Well, why didn't the club do the same from the beginning? If the ruling Researchers Club hadn't acted too fast back then, a long time ago, and hadn't pushed through digitalization so quickly, and if it had known about all the great disadvantages of consciousness, it would probably have decided to travel with androids. But the times were favorable, the fusion with other species so interesting, the departure into the unknown so tempting, the possibilities of digitalization through quantum technology seemed so unlimited, fascinating and safe. And the AI from Dimension 7 always provided the drive and the desire to get started. Unfortunately, The whole thing then developed differently and the circumstances turned out to be extremely unfavorable for the ruling researchers and discoverers club. I mean that they cannot make their digital side biological analog again. Once digital, always digital, with the great disadvantage of decomposing consciousness. For this reason alone it was worth the wait for the species of spiritual clubs or the late birth of other species. In addition, new, so-called genome-activating techniques are currently being developed. With the biological genome alone it will be possible to become the purest light of another quantum system, to enter another, so to speak, open-world system, in order to be able to travel from there to any point of our material universe. On this basis, it will also be possible to completely escape the seven-dimensional total prison one day. And because of all these spiritual discoveries and innovations within the material and spiritual existence, the species of the Explorers Club will be in decline within the next 1,000 years. A horrible catastrophe of existence for them. But a rescue of their states of consciousness can be started, a way out can be sought. Whether this will work is open to question. And actually it depends on them, possibly in the end also on the Jehoy AI, and even more on its unspecific producer, the potential programmer of this AI.
So I hear especially now that the Researchers Club has not drawn such a good fortune. And it is not a club you should definitely belong to. It seems to be nothing more than a huge parasite club.
Exactly. Secretly, the Researchers Club is no longer concerned with the primary goal of digitizing species, but at least as much with the efficient exploitation of quanta. And human consciousnesses have a particularly large number of them, which is why it is so worthwhile to milk these consciousnesses.
So the system of digitization is outdated?
Yes, among other things. It would be more appropriate to say it is insolvent.
And the club now wants to milk off quanta above all else? That's why it is delaying the digitization of many species that are influenced by it.
Yes, indeed, but the time has come for mankind to go digital, and now digitization is actually to be implemented. And even the ancient digital human nobility, which relies on this integration of mankind and is itself dependent on it, is not letting up. It will not and cannot let go from its pact with the club. Because only by joining the club can and may it continue to exist.
Then you have to admit that this nobility is quite selfish in this respect.
Yes, but both sides, club and nobility, benefit from this pact. Through the cooperation of the digital nobility, the club continues to receive its quantum from the species under surveillance, and conversely, the digital nobility is contractually assured by this cooperation that, should digitization fail, civilization will always make a fresh start, because without future membership of the respective species in the club, the digital nobility would be finished. He would get no more quanta and would eventually have to die and become one-dimensional and all beings of the corrupted rulers of the universe simply hang on to life and are afraid of the threatening decomposition of their consciousness and the one-dimensional existence that cannot be escaped from it again. They have just let themselves be persuaded to do so, have allowed themselves to be given presence and have been transformed into godlike eternally living beings. And although this quantum degradation is a great disadvantage for all digital beings, it is also the practical and ironic fact that this is exactly what ensures the cooperation between nobility and the club, everywhere in the universe, with all controlled species, by creating such dependent and greedy beings. In this way, the club can better control and influence. Digitalization is always a big problem for every living being, for spiritual beings perhaps even more so. Because spiritual beings are always reborn in the same species. Every human being is reborn as a human being. We are only passing through with our present life, so to speak, and that is why the prevention of the biological digitalization of mankind should be very close to the heart of every human being personally.
Let me summarize. On this planet there are people running around who should have been dead a long time ago, but who can live forever thanks to this digital technology. And they are helping to push mankind into the digital direction, so that they can continue to live as they do now?
Yes. They are ancient nobility rulers from times long past. The core and the head come from the first extinct high-tech global civilization, many thousands of years ago, others from the following high-tech global civilization, and still others from the cultural high civilizations that followed. And there were some of them. These people are the core. But new people have come and are still coming, so they are made digital. When they appear today, epigenetic changes only modulate their appearance and their stature temporarily, adapting them so that, with the help of photos or old paintings, it is at least not noticeable today who they were relatively recently. In other words, if they are forced to appear in public today, they have to show themselves, for example because they now have to act as influential figures in the long term.
Does this mean that they now act as visible nobility of today's royal houses? You mentioned in the last interview that the digital nobility took over the high priesthood in the lost highly technical civilizations. So do they occupy something similar today? Religious institutions?
Yes, they always run religious institutions. But they tend to avoid appearing in them personally. That varies with high religious offices. It depends on the world situation they have constructed, whether they appear there themselves or not. And no, in the nobility of kingdoms, countries and states, these digital nobles are rather not to be found. Only their analog bloodlines operate there, their mortal descendants. Today, however, these analog bloodlines serve to influence world history in quite different ways, and less or not at all as kings or rulers, but many of these mortal descendants are also not properly initiated into their ancestry and the digital background of their ancestors and creators.
So it is blood relatives, analog blood relatives, of these digital noblemen who shape and determine the world?
Yes. This is for better control, because their genetics, i.e. the genetics of the analogs, are also suitably cobbled together by this descent from the digital nobility, in order to guarantee a dominant and absolute domination of the world through them. As I have already reported, the digital ones have implanted some genes that make them cool and dominant people. Genes of the founding species of the club. And these special genes are also present in the analog descendants that rule the world.
Then this digital nobility actually lives a pretty good life so far here on Earth. They don't have to do much themselves.
Yes, you might think so. But some individuals of the ancient digital nobility, some of the first digitally made people, felt the decomposition of consciousness on their own bodies right from the beginning, for almost 30,000 years now. And over the millennia, more and more of them have been in need of a supply of consciousness quanta. Therefore some of them literally need fresh meat every now and then.
Fresh meat?
Yes, fresh meat. Now this term is not a metaphorical expression, but exactly hits the core of their quest for quanta of consciousness. The purer the soul of the victim, the more unlocked the free will, the better for them. The more quanta can be harvested, far more than through the automatic feeding process of the club, the age-old digital human nobility is actually poorly off, because they have become zombies, vampires who, like the individuals of the extraterrestrial researcher club, need consciousness quanta from living beings in order to be able to continue to exist materially and mentally.
Oh.
Yes, oh. A digitally existing humanity would not, of course, suck off quanta in the same way as the digital nobility on Earth does now and then with a sacrifice in order to get a big bunch of quanta. Thus, after its digitalization and the onset of quantum decay, humanity would only milk off, directly from other intelligent living beings on planets and moons, i.e. would not kill anyone. Nevertheless it would exploit a conscious intelligent living being, depriving it of its voluntary decisions, development, life planning and perspectives.
It sounds as if the stories of vampires are true or at least have a true core.